Good morning, everyone. I'm very honored to be here today to be celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Osher Center. What I want to do is, I'm going to be talking about my thoughts about the importance and evolution of research at the Osher Center. And as I was thinking about this talk, I was remembering with such nostalgia my years as the first research director of the Osher Center, while also realizing how much the research of Osher has grown and evolved so appropriately and so successfully over time. So I would like to touch briefly on three things. Number one, how I got here, what attracted me to the Osher Center. Number two, how our research questions have changed. So the progression of research from does it work to how does it work? And finally, what's next? The current and future role of research at the Osher Center. So how did I get here? My collaboration with the Osher Center started about 20 years ago when I first got to know David Eisenberg and had the opportunity to work with him on research philosophy and research strategies of the center. In my usual research job, besides getting the opportunity to work at the Osher Center, I was and am doing very traditional research. I'm conducting large-scale, randomized trials, looking at whether there are simple things that we can do to reduce our risk of developing chronic diseases like heart disease and cancer for the very first time. So specifically, I evaluate the possible preventive effects of a number of promising but unproven hypotheses, such as low-dose aspirin, nutritional supplements such as vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin C, fish oil, and multivitamins, and nutritional changes such as reducing salt or reducing fats. And for every trial I do, the overarching goal is the same: to provide solid evidence that will advance our knowledge and thus inform evidence-based recommendations. Similarly, the core scientific underpinning of the trials are the same: to conduct a study whose results are judged by our scientific community to be valid or true, to disseminate the knowledge widely through publications and presentations, and to inform regulatory agencies such as the FDA or professional organizations such as the American Cancer Society, so they can consider these data in making their clinical and their public health recommendations. But meanwhile, I was becoming more and more fascinated with the field of what then was called CAM, Complementary and Alternative Medicine. I was fascinated by its approaches, fascinated by its extensive history, but when it came to the evidence-based data that I wanted to see, no differently than I want to see the evidence-based data if I'm deciding to take a newly developed drug, or even if I'm trying to figure out to get a second booster shot for COVID. And those evidence-based data for CAM therapies were rarely there. And making it even more complex, there also seemed to be a tremendous amount of emotion associated with the use or non-use of CAM. There were groups that firmly believed that decades, centuries of use provided sufficient evidence of efficacy, and others who would remain firmly skeptical or even dismissive regardless of the evidence. Even the names used, both Don mentioned it, Peter mentioned it, so complementary, alternative, unconventional, non-traditional, unorthodox, suggested that these therapies were considered promising but unproven by traditional practitioners. So I became increasingly convinced that the goal of all research in integrative therapies has to provide the same high standards of evaluation that are expected and required of conventional medicine with its Western methods. But I was also more than a little naive when I first got started doing research in this field. I had no idea just how complex evaluating integrative therapies with the highest level of rigor and precision would be. I was used to designing a trial looking at something like if we take omega-3 fatty acids fish oil supplements for the prevention of cardiovascular disease, would it be effective? And when I was designing the trial, there were already broadly accepted definitions of the dose and formulation of fish oil interventions and commonly accepted cardiovascular disease manifestations to use as outcomes. However, when Peter Wayne, for example, began his trials of Tai Chi for whole body stability in women at risk of fall and related fractures, it was not yet clear what would constitute an appropriate dose or regimen of Tai Chi. What would be objective and clinically meaningful outcomes of balance that should be used? And what were the mechanisms by which Tai Chi would be working to increase balance? So to me, it became clear that no one could question that doing a valid study in integrative therapies can be on an order of magnitude more challenging than more traditional interventions. But the bottom line is, if we're going to change culture and we're going to have impact, everything that's being explored or newly claimed or outside the system requires rigorous science with a goal of translating the evidence into a recommendation. For something as challenging to evaluate as CAM, there will be even more scrutiny and higher bars of evidence for acceptance of the findings. And evaluating it rigorously, will it require new teams and new methods and new paradigms and new models of thinking and the breaking of new ground and a fundamental commitment to connections. When David Eisenberg published his paper indicating that a third of the US were using CAM, it was clear that many were using these therapies without a definitive evidence of benefit or harm. And thus, it also became clear that it was urgent and imperative for us to provide the evidence in ways that would be widely accepted. If a therapy, anything, Tai Chi, acupuncture, is demonstrated through our accepted and common research language to be efficacious and safe with respect to a particular outcome, then more people should be considering using it. And if it's not demonstrated to be effective or safe, then people need to know that too, in order to inform their own decision-making process and allow our precious funding resources to be turned to exploring other promising paths. So how have our research questions changed? The first stage of the research at the Osher Center focused on the clinically important and timely questions of whether CAM therapies work. Is a given therapy efficacious and safe for a particular outcome? But then in the next stages of our research, investigators such as Helene and Peter took the evaluation of questions to the next level by asking not just if a technique works, but how? What are the mechanisms? So elucidating mechanisms requires cutting-edge techniques like medical imaging or biomechanics to move the field forward. But it equally requires the novel methodology and ways of thinking developed by Ted Kapchuk and Catherine Hall to both better design and better interpret the study findings. So one example of the interdisciplinary techniques that are now used can be seen in a study by Peter Wayne, on which I was a collaborator, in which he evaluated the impact of Tai Chi on fracture-related risk factors in postmenopausal women. And one of the most difficult components of the design of this study was, how do you assess objective measures of balance? So Peter approached the Motion Analysis Laboratory at the Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital here in Boston. And in a biomotion sub-study, they used video camera-based movement analysis systems that included infrared cameras and force platforms. This involved a lot of specialized work and expense, but substantially maximized the credibility of the study results. The first time I saw these data, I can't even tell you how excited I was. This was a truly interdisciplinary approach, connecting integrative therapies and biomechanics in a language that could be understood and respected by all. And then poor Peter, I invited him to give a seminar on this study to every one of my research design classes. but mainly so the students could see how working together, the basics of our respective techniques can apply to a wide range of important non-traditional questions. And so what's next? Looking forward, rigorous research will always be a major part of the Osher strategic plan. We will still evaluate the core questions of whether an intervention works using novel methods to evaluate, but we'll also increasingly evaluate it using objective markers of mechanisms. In addition, we will increasingly connect with leading-edge technology and tools to address important questions for our aging society. From the bread and butter questions related to diseases such as cardiovascular disease, chronic obstructive lung disease, and metabolic syndrome, to the compelling common and practical concerns about the prevention of falls and fractures, the prevention of loss of cognitive function and getting dementia with aging. So evaluation of these mind-body questions are being led by Peter and Gloria Ye, are heavily interdisciplinary and international in scope, and include leading-edge technology and tools. For example, there are 2 real gems of grants that are currently under consideration for funding from the National Institutes of Health. The first one, in collaboration with Hebrew Senior Life, we proposed a randomized trial of Tai Chi versus health education in reducing the loss of cognitive function with aging. But in an exploratory subcomponent, they're looking at fMRI brain imaging to characterize how resting and task-based functional connectivity are impacted by the interventions, and how what you see on the imaging relates to improvements in executive health and gait health. And in the second trial, measures of daily living gait and daily living physical activity will be evaluated with wearable sensors and machine learning tools for their association with risk of injurious falls in order to identify high-risk older adults who may particularly benefit from closer clinical management and evidence-based fall prevention strategies. So the bottom line is that I think the basic concepts of rigorous scientific evaluation won't change, but the questions they are going to be applied to will change. And the evidence that's being generated by program centers like the Osher Center will be what moves our field forward scientifically, but it will also foster the growth of our future leaders who will continue our mission. Thank you very much. So now we're going to hear from Gloria Ye, who is both the Director of Clinical Research as well as the Director of the T32 Postdoctoral Fellowship in Integrative Medicine. And Dr. Ye will be speaking on moving forward in research.